Number 3. Key concept. What is the difference between exponential growth and logistic growth? Answer. First of all, the J-shaped curve indicates that the population is undergoing exponential growth. Exponential growth occurs when individuals in a population reproduce at a constant rate. Under ideal conditions, with unlimited resources, a population will grow exponentially. On the other hand, logistic growth is as resources become less available, the growth of a population slows or stops. The general S-shaped curve of this growth pattern, called logistic growth. Logistic growth occurs when a population's growth slows or stops following a period of exponential growth. Number 4. What is meant by population density? Answer. Population density is the number of individuals per unit area. This number can vary tremendously depending on the species and its ecosystem. Number 5. Define carrying capacity. Answer. If you look at a graph that involves yeast population, you will see a horizontal line through the region of the graph where the growth of the yeast population has leveled off. The point at which the line intersects the y-axis tells you the size of the population when the average growth rate reaches 0. That number in turn represents the largest number of individuals, in this case yeast cells, that a given environment can support. Ecologists call this number the carrying capacity of the environment for a particular species. Chapter 5-2 Limits to Growth. Now that you know a few things about population growth, think about the sea otter example in the beginning of the previous section. When a sea otter population declines, something has changed the relationship between the birth and death rate, or between the rates of immigration and emigration. For instance, in part of the sea otter's range, the death rate of sea otters is increasing because killer whales are eating the otters. Predation by killer whales creates a situation that reduces the growth of the sea otter population. Limiting factors. Recall from Chapter 3 that the primary productivity of an ecosystem can be reduced when there is an insufficient supply of a particular nutrient. Ecologists call such substances limiting nutrients. A limiting nutrient is an example of a more general ecological concept, a limiting factor. In the context of populations, a limiting factor is a factor that causes population growth to decrease. A resource base that is limited can also affect the long-term survival of a species. For example, pandas depend for food on bamboo that grow in certain kinds of temperate forests in China. Since the time that these forests have been cleared for timber and farmland, panda populations have fallen dramatically and have become isolated in small pockets of remaining forests. Density-dependent factors. A limiting factor that depends on population size is called a density-dependent limiting factor. Density-dependent factors become limiting only when the population density, the number of organisms per unit area, reaches a certain level. These factors operate most strongly when a population is large and dense. They do not affect small, scattered populations as greatly. Density-dependent limiting factors include competition, predation, parasitism, and disease. Competition. When populations become crowded, organisms compete with one another for food, water, space, sunlight, and other essentials. For example, puffins must compete for limited nesting sites. Competition among members of the same species is a density-dependent limiting factor. The more individuals living in an area, the sooner they use up the available resources. Likewise, the fewer the number of individuals, the more resources are available to them, and the less they must compete with one another. Competition can also occur between members of different species. This type of competition is a major force behind evolutionary change. When two species compete for the same resources, both species are under pressure to change in ways that decrease their competition. Over time, the species may evolve to occupy separate niches. That is because, as you may recall, no two species can occupy the same niche in the same place at the same time. Predation. Populations in nature are often controlled by predation. The regulation of a population by predation takes place within a predatory-prey relationship, one of the best-known mechanisms of population control. The relationships between sea otters and sea urchins and between sea otters and killer whales are examples of predator-prey interactions that affect population growth. A well-documented example of a predator-prey relationship is the interaction between wolves and moose on Isle Royale, an island in Lake Superior. If we were to make a graph with this kind of data, the graph would show how periodic increases in the moose population. The prey on Isle Royale are quickly followed by increases in the wolf population, the predators. As the wolves prey on the moose population falls. The decline in the moose population is followed, sooner or later, by a decline in the wolf population because there is less for the wolves to feed upon. A decline in the wolf populations means that the moose have fewer enemies, so the moose population rises again. This cycle of predator and prey populations can be repeated indefinitely. Parasitism and disease. Parasites can also limit the growth of a population. Parasitic organisms range in size from microscopic, disease-causing bacteria to tapeworms 30 centimeters or more in length. These organisms are similar to predators in many ways. Like predators, parasites take nourishment at the expense of their hosts, often weakening them and causing disease or death. The wasp's cocoons, for example, can weaken or kill many caterpillars. Density-independent factors. Density-independent limiting factors affect all populations in similar ways, regardless of population size. Unusual weather, natural disasters, seasonal cycles, and certain human activities such as damming rivers and clear-cutting forests are all examples of density-independent limiting factors. In response to such factors, many species show a characteristic crash in population size. After the crash, the population may soon build up again, or it may stay low for some time. For some species, storms or hurricanes can nearly extinguish a population. For example, tripes, aphids, and other insects that feed on plant buds and leaves may be washed out by a heavy rainstorm. Extremes of cold or hot weather can also take their toll on a population, regardless of the population's density. A severe winter frost, for example, can kill giant saguaro cactuses in the Arizona desert. In some areas, periodic droughts can also affect entire populations of vegetation. Such events can, in turn, affect the populations of consumers within the food web. Environments are always changing, and most populations can adapt to a certain amount of change. Populations often grow and shrink in response to such changes. Major upsets in an ecosystem, however, can lead to long-term declines in certain populations. Human activities have caused some of these major upsets, as you'll read soon. Chapter 5-2 Section Assessment. Number 1. Key Concept. List 3 density-dependent factors and 3 density-independent factors that can limit the growth of a population. Answer. Density-dependent limiting factors include competition, predation, parasitism, and disease, while density-independent limiting factors include unusual weather, natural disasters, seasonal cycles, and certain human activities such as damming rivers and clear-cutting forests are all examples. Number 2. What is the relationship between competition and population size? Answer. When populations become crowded, organisms compete with one another for food, water, space, sunlight, and other essentials. Competition among members of the same species is a density-dependent limiting factor. The more individuals living in an area, the sooner they use up the available resources. Likewise, the fewer the number of individuals, the more resources are available to them, and the less they must compete with one another. Competition can also occur between members of different species. This type of competition is a major force behind evolutionary change. When two species compete for the same resources, both species are under pressure to change in ways that decrease their competition. Over time, the species may evolve to occupy separate niches. That is because, as you may recall, no two species can occupy the same niche in the same place at the same time. Number 3. If an entire lynx population disappears, what is likely to happen to the hare population on which it preys? Answer. If an entire lynx population were to disappear, then the hare population would increase tremendously due to no predators preying on them. But at some time of their life, there would not be enough food for everyone. This would mean that at some point, the hare population would also decrease. Number 4. Identify how limited resource can affect the size of a population. Give an example that illustrates this situation. Answer. Well, for some species, storms or hurricanes can nearly extinguish a population. For example, thrips, aphids, and other insects that feed on plant buds and leaves might be washed out by a heavy rainstorm.